Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video. We're going to be starting out on the first part of what is a graphics card, how do they work, and so on. This is going to be a pretty damn complicated topic. We're going to be starting out with the very basics, what is a GPU, and what are its functions, and also how has it changed over time compared to, say, older cards. Then we're going to be moving on to much more complicated subjects like how do GPUs work? As in, what's the rendering process and the buses on a GPU, the interface, and a lot more besides, including, for example, APIs. This is going to be quite a complicated series, and as I said, it's going to be span over multiple videos. I have absolutely no idea how many offhand, but we're going to be starting things out fairly simply in this video. As I said, we're going to be discussing exactly what a GPU is and what their purpose is inside of a system. Now, obviously, GPUs, for those of you who are not that familiar with them, are seen in, say, the next generation consoles, and indeed they were in the previous generation as well, and as well as, for example, a PC. And of course, they come in discrete variety, in other words, like a proper board that you would fit inside your PC, or a more integrated solution like you would see in, say, the PlayStation 4, all part of the same APU, and there's a lot more variants besides. So in this series, we're going to be really looking at that, what the differences are in them, and much more. So let's start out with a very basic question. What exactly does a GPU do? Well, as it turns out, GPUs have not always been GPUs. Originally, they were basically very simple as compared to all of the graphics systems of today. Back then, they were primarily just pixel shaders, and they were responsible for rendering. They were known as graphics processors. It wasn't until later on, subsequently in the late 90s and early 2000s, that things such as being able to transform, light the scene, and even triangle and clipping was held and run on the GPUs. And so there's actually been three evolutions. There were the initial, I'm talking about 3D cards here. The original one was basically texturing, mostly texturing, and these cards would be, for example, the early Voodoos, for example, the Voodoo 1, Voodoo 2. Don't worry, guys, we will be going into this a lot more detail later on. Then the later cards would be able to handle things such as transform and lighting, triangle setup. A great example of that would be, for example, NVIDIA's GeForce range, the original GeForce. Then, for a long time, this continued with a fixed function design, and then we got to a more evolved state. Now we've got to the GPUs of today. These are the GPUs which make compute possible. These are the GPUs that are the reason that the PlayStation 4 and modern day PCs, just for example, you can count the Xbox in there by all means, are capable of doing the things that they are doing. And these are basically programmable graphics cards, which really started with, say, NVIDIA's 800 range back in the day, but has certainly improved ever since with much better APIs, which we'll go into, of course, much better hardware support, and much more powerful hardware as well. Now, originally, 2D and 3D was generally speaking held, or should I say handled, by two separate cards inside the PC. Traditionally, you would have like an integrated or a very low-end 2D card in the system, and then you would be able to plug in a 3D accelerator, like a dedicated 3D accelerator. An example of that would be 3DFX's Voodoo range. In case you're wondering what happened to 3DFX, they were actually bought out by NVIDIA. And that's how NVIDIA actually started to use SLI. Originally, SLI was used on the Voodoo 2 cards, which, as I mentioned, was produced by 3DFX. Now, back then, the cards were very, very primitive. And they would primarily, for example, handle texture mapping and that type of thing. And we will go into what all this stuff means, as I said, a bit later on. So, in this generation of consoles that was comparable at the time, the PlayStation 1 and the N64, they actually started to use 3D hardware as well. That's one of the reasons that the PlayStation 1, for example, looks so much better than, say, the SNES or the previous generation. It actually did have some 3D hardware inside it. The very early Voodoo 1 and Voodoo 2 cards had extensions written for games, which used what was known as Glide. This meant that titles at the time, such as, say, Quake 1, started to be released on the scene, and there were soon various adaptations which improved the graphics of the game. You would most noticeably see better lighting, better textures, high resolution as well. This is because, of course, that texturing and so forth wasn't necessarily the forte of the CPU. Therefore, it makes sense to offload it to a device which is much more capable of doing so. If you actually compare the cards of then to cards of today, they were extremely primitive. They had, a couple of megabytes to 4 megabytes of memory on, say, the Voodoo 2, and they were pretty slow, but they were at the time more than capable of playing games at the rather astounding resolution of like 640 by 480, or in the Voodoo 2's case, they would be able to max out with like 800 by 600. At that time as well, the emergence of not just many players in the graphics industry, such as, for example, NVIDIA, and of course 3DFX, as well as ATI, who of course AMD have now purchased. But you've also got a lot of APIs that were starting to come about. Microsoft really started to push DirectX. We'll be going heavily into what DirectX is in another video. Then, of course, OpenGL started to come about as well, and Glide. Now, Glide was specific to the Voodoo cards, and as it turns out, the Voodoo cards actually did better generally thanks to Glide. It was a very optimized mini driver, if you will, and because it was optimized specifically for the cards, it didn't have to rely on like a general purpose that all the other cards did. So, for example, you can actually run a game on, say, a Voodoo 2 or Voodoo 3 or whatever card without Glide, but you would notice the performance generally would suffer compared to using Glide, and that's simply because Glide was specifically designed for the Voodoo cards to get the most performance out of it. And because 3DFX at the time were, well, let's just say the market leaders, they could get away with a lot of this stuff. Now, as a general rule for discrete graphics cards, they actually have their own inbuilt memory, or built straight onto the circuit board. You'll actually have the processor itself, and then of course you would have various power distribution, as well as the control interface, the heatsink and fan, and various other bits and bobs as well. The purpose, very simply here, is that obviously assets related to the games that are deemed to be usable on the video card, for example textures and whatever else, it will be stored locally on the GPU, and then of course the graphics processor would then process the data. We'll go a lot more into that later on, including what various types of connectors and whatever else as well. And so you started to get, later on, this started for a long time, the graphics cards started to evolve, the video cards started to evolve from things such as, for example, 16-bit rendering to 32-bit rendering. This is color rendering, so all this simply means is you're going from like thousands of colors to like 16.7 million colors or whatever. You started to get anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering, and I will be going into this stuff later on. And this continued over time, but basically they realized that there was a finite limit to how far we could go. In other words, to put it simply, the GPU or the graphics system was able to render things faster than the processor could. And as it was turning out, you would have these really fast CPUs that were being limited in terms of what they could do in other tasks, because a lot of the time they were becoming very CPU bound. Now, don't get me wrong, this still happens now, but it's to a smaller degree than what it used to be. But The bigger issue was that CPUs of the time, and even now, they just weren't really capable of doing things such as geometry and lighting and whatever else as smoothly as what they should be for the games that were coming out. We'd gone past the cute games of like Quake 1 and the early Tomb Raider, in other words, the titles which were the early pioneers. You know, you could see that the graphics were improving over time, and titles like, for example, the original Half-Life, yes, it looked pretty damn fantastic. For the time, of course, was that caveat. But John Carmack and others wanted more. Engines were becoming somewhat stagnant. And despite the fact that certain games like the Unreal engines did look fantastic for the time, they started to realise the limitations. And so Nvidia were the first who were widely given the credit anyway with the GeForce 256 range. This was the successor to the TNT-2. At this point, 3D effects were still in the game, but they didn't go the hardware TNL route, and to be honest with you, at this point, 3D effects were pretty much on the ropes. This was due to a couple of reasons. One of the reasons, actually, was that Sega originally did buy quite a lot of stocks in 3D effects, if I remember correctly, but they decided pretty much at the last minute. I mean, it came down to a couple of choices in hardware. One of them was 3D effects for the video processing. The other was, and the actual one they ended up going with was Power VR. And this was a very crippling blow because it really hurt 3D effects' share prices at the time. And also, 3D effects were notoriously slow in giving 32-bit rendering, which was a bit unfair because of the way their processors worked. It was actually better than 16-bit internally, but that's a different story, and it's quite a long story as well. So what the GeForce 256 did is that it increased the amount of fixed pixel pipelines and also added what was known as a hardware transform and lighting engine into it as well. NVIDIA also defined this at the time, and it is, and I quote, that this is their definition, NVIDIA's, a single chip processor with integrated transform, lighting, triangle setup / clipping, and rendering engine that is capable of processing a minimum of 10 million polygons per second. Now, the problem was with all of this, as you can imagine, graphics evolutions take time. In other words, let's say I am a video card manufacturer and you are a games developer. Let's say, just for argument's sake, you are id Software, you are Capcom, whatever your favorite company is, place your, butts there. When you are doing something like producing a game, you have to make sure that as many people as possible can play it. And sure, in your own mind, you would love to be able to, show off the shiniest graphics. You would love to be able to, implement all of this technology, but there's a couple of issues. Firstly, you need to get used to it yourselves. Second issue is that, what about if your customers require an add-on card or an upgrade and they just don't want to pump it out for your game? And so it takes a long time. It takes basically people to slowly start the uptake of the GPUs, and of course, eventually, the older the older processors, video processors such as the TNT2s, the Voodoo 3s, and whatever else were slowly phased out. Remember at the time that graphics cards such as the TNT Ultra 2 were up to about 50% slower, according to NVIDIA, but we'll go into that in just a moment. But the problem was, look, if you had a decent gaming rig at the time, let's say for example you had a Voodoo, like a Voodoo 2 SLI rig, for the most part, people just didn't really want to upgrade. And what was really happening, of course, back then is this is when overclocking was really starting to become huge. And people would buy something like the Celeron 300A, and they would buy that CPU and they would overclock the hell out of it. You would get like 300 megahertz for 300A, all the way up to like 450, maybe even slightly more. Sometimes if you're really lucky, you might be able to get 500. This is all assuming air and a reasonable cooler, by the way. We're not talking about liquid under liquid, so for example water or whatever, or something really extravagant here. And so what started to happen is that if you actually had a really fast CPU in there, if your CPU was really meaty, such as say 300 megahertz Pentium 2 or faster, what would typically start happening is that an older GPU, an older graphics card, for example like a Voodoo 2 or whatever, mostly because people were running at lower resolutions, it would actually, generally speaking, be a little bit faster because the support at this time was really low. I mean, it was, you know, dicey at best, and it wasn't games like, say, Quake 3 that really started to push this forward. So you can imagine that the issue here, that now CPU bound takes on a different meaning. Now it's really graphics system bound, because this is one of the reasons that people have to upgrade their cards at this point, because obviously you can imagine that it doesn't matter if your CPU is meaty enough, and that's why you were having people upgrade their graphics card a lot more often than what they were their CPU. There was another issue as well, of course, with the GeForce, the early GeForces, and that was it was SDR. This was SDR RAM, which is single data RAM, and that just wasn't fast enough to provide the data to the graphics system. That was actually echoed as well in the GeForce 2. And this kind of happened for a long time. We started to get evolutions in the hardware, and it was going okay, but there were issues with it. I'm not going to go into all of them in this particular video. We will go into this more when I start to really break down the subject, but suffice to say, one of the big issues with it was that you were oftentimes getting wasted parts of the graphics card. In other words, at times you would have an operation that was running that wasn't using a certain part of the graphics system. And so what you would have is basically a pipeline that had been very well established that was now starting to be turned on its head. And so, for example, it would go like vertex, then triangle, then pixel, then it would be ROP, and then finally it would be memory. And this would be how things continue to evolve. But as I said, there's issues with this, primarily that if one stage of a game was slowing down the hardware, then the rest of the hardware would just be sitting there doing nothing. And so what started to happen is you started to go more towards a unified shader architecture. This meant that their shaders were able to process vertices, pixels, geometry, whatever the balls you needed them to do. This meant that as a games developer you would have to constantly concern yourself and think to yourself, well, how did I create my game? How is it optimized? Am I making one stage too difficult for, say, a graphics card to handle? Am I going to have inconsistencies with my engine? And by the time, for example, we got to DirectX 10, that also started to improve things as well. When DX10 was introduced, it started to reduce the CPU overhead. Basically, this was to do with the way the API, Application Programming Interface, also known as DX, in this case anyway, was actually constructed or written. And because the CPU was required to constantly issue some of the commands to the API by the application, in other words, it would keep basically, if you want one way to put it, you could say that it's keep asking for its approval to run the commands. It's not exactly right, but you know, it's just for intents and purposes for explanation. You can imagine that this started to drastically improve, or drastically increase the demand on the CPU. And so whether it was something simple, for example, blending modes or changing of textures or whatever it needed to do, high CPU, I'm just doing this now, high CPU, can you imagine how that would start grinding on the CPU, which is already doing millions of different other tasks anyway. And this continued more and more and more forward. Now, of course, we're going to briefly go into compute. So compute is another function of GPUs, and for those of you who are familiar with my PlayStation 4 and Xbox One videos, you're probably going to be painfully familiar with compute as well. Compute, of course, basically allows graphics systems to run various different commands that aren't really graphics orientated, but they are just, graphics cards are just really good at this because of their parallel computing. As I said, a lot of this started with the G80 architecture anyway, and AMD, or back then ATI, went one direction and NVIDIA went the other direction. It just so happens that NVIDIA got it right, and AMD somewhat went back on this for the GCN core architecture. In other words, the architecture that powers like the Radeon 7000 series, as well as, of course, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Now, compute, of course, has tons of different benefits. Primarily that it doesn't really impact CPU time as much on tasks that the CPU isn't really that good at doing. Think of just how many flops of performance that you can get from a graphics card of today. The PS4, for example, has 1.84 T-flops. The Xbox One has about 1.31, 1.32, depending on the decimal place. And of course, PCs now have 2, 4, whatever T-flops of computing power. In other words, it's immense. And one of the reasons they do this is because of stream processors. Now, I'm going to give a very brief overview on this in this video. It's not going to be lengthy. That's going to be for the next video. I don't want to start mixing up subject matters too much. As I said, this is just a brief overview. A stream processor, of course, is basically multiple different little processors on the same die. They're all issued to command, and they will process that data in an order, unless, of course, it's something else that's given a higher priority, in which case that data will be stopped being processed for a moment while the higher importance task is then accomplished, and then it will go back to processing what it was. And this is why you've got what is known as SIMD, also known as occasionally as SIMD, which stands for Single Instruction Multi-Data. In other words, a single instruction, then you get multiple datas. In other words, all of those little processes are going towards the same task. Now, comparatively, a lot of CPUs are in the 100 to 200 G-flops range, not T-flops, G-flops. And we'll go into why a lot more in another video. It's just the way that processors work. Processors are a lot more general function. And because of this, of course, they're simply not really good at performing different tasks. That's why even a lot of software packages now, for example, from Discrete for, say, 3D Studio Max or for, say, Adobe Premiere, they all use GPU encoding, for example. A lot of the encoding or previews and stuff are done on the GPU. And the purpose behind this is, unsurprisingly, extremely simple. It's so that the GPU can handle a lot of the work and the CPU doesn't have to strain itself so much, and the tasks can not only be done more efficiently, in other words, you actually get a better render preview a lot of the time, but more to the point, you also get it done a hell of a lot faster. GPU, or general purpose computing, basically done on a graphics card, is really the future that a lot of people start seeing right now, because it will allow much better AI, much better physics, and much better ray tracing and goodness knows what else to be done straight on the GPU. And that's really what it's about right now. You have to really maximize on just what the strengths of a particular processor is. There's no point in just, pretending that the CPU can do everything, of course. And so we're getting into the state where GPUs are becoming increasingly more popular. And of course, if you were to also look at, say, consoles, you can see exactly the same thing right there as well. The Xbox 360 used a fairly unified design for its GPU. Of course, it went with AMD, or should I say ATI back then. Its GPU was based on like the X1800 XTs, and the PlayStation 3's was based on the 7000 range from NVIDIA, so that would be the RSX GPU. And of course, now we're on to the next generation. Now we're on to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, which are based entirely on proper unified shader architectures and stream processors and whatever else we'll go into a lot more in a video or two's time. And now we're getting into GPUs which are no longer using like EDO RAM or DDR1 RAM. We're actually getting into GPUs that are using, of course, GDDR5. And consoles, of course, have bandwidth of like 176 gigabytes per second. And in the case of discrete GPUs, in other words, for say a PC, we're talking 150, 200, 250 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. We're talking profound amounts of memory bandwidth here, which of course is required because of the rather ludicrous amount of T-flops of computing power that the cards actually have to process now. Anyway, that's about it in this particular video. It's been a fairly short one and not too technical, but I'm hoping it's given you guys a brief overview of not just the history, but also what a GPU is, what their purposes is, and so on. In subsequent videos, we're going to be diving a lot more into the tech of a video card. As I said, we're going to be discussing APIs, we're going to be discussing more in depth the evolution of them, we're going to be discussing a lot more on the rendering pipeline process, we're going to be discussing a lot more, hopefully I'm going to be getting you guys some visual examples as well of things such as physics and textures and whatever else, and it should be a pretty cool little series. I have no idea how frequently these videos are going to be put up. I was doing the PS4 video of it, PS4 versus Xbox One videos daily for the most part, apart from the very last video, which I wanted one extra day just to think about my final conclusions. These I'm not so sure about because the next couple of days are going to be really busy for me. And also I want to try and use a bit more, if appropriate, I want to try and use some visual representation as well. So I'm not really sure how often they're going to be done, but it shouldn't be much more than, say, every 3 or 4 days or something like that. That's what I'm shooting for anyway. So it shall be a good series. I've also got ones based on memory, graphics cards. Graphics as in like various the various graphics techniques and language and verbiage and so on that's used. We're also going to be looking at CPUs and what and how they work. We're also going to be looking at many other different things as well, including things such as latency and lag, and it's going to be pretty cool. So we've got a hell of a lot to look at, and for the most part, I'm really looking forward to not just doing the research on it, because as I said to you guys, I don't necessarily know everything offhand, so sometimes I have to do some extra research. For example, I might have like a weak point in my knowledge, and therefore it forces me to be like, okay, well I have to talk about this now, and now I have to do research on it. And I famously have said that my PS4 versus Xbox One video series, I probably put about 15 hours of research into it, because obviously sometimes it takes like 20 minutes to find a relevant link, or trying to find like a developer interview, then doing analysis, and then trying to find someone to corroborate the story, and goodness knows what else. It takes a while to do this stuff, but I really enjoy it regardless. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. As I said, it's fairly brief for mine, but it's the cornerstone of the series, so it just gives, hopefully it puts most people on the same page. Hopefully this is a brief overview just to get everyone on roughly the same page so we can start talking about more technical stuff. As normal, I will try to keep the stuff to a minimum in terms of jargon, and if there is something that I feel that needs to be further explained, I will try to explain it the best I can. And then you guys, if you don't feel that's a good enough explanation, you can always stalk me on Facebook. That'll be facebook.com/redgamingtech, and I can either give you guys a verbal, or should I say a written explanation there, or I can make another little short video just to explain it if you feel like I've done a shitty job on a particular aspect. Anyway, I'm going to get going. I will hopefully see you guys soon. Take care. Bye for now.